All right, good. Welcome. My name is Peter Meissen. I'm the director here at the Sims Center, and this is our monthly evening where we talk about San Diego's, we call it the green scene. How sustainable is San Diego in all of its forms, in water, energy, transportation. Tonight we're thrilled to have Councilman Mark Kersey. Councilman Kersey is with the 5th District, which is Northeast San Diego. And we are going to talk about infrastructure, not the sexiest topic, but one of the most important things, really, I think, in San Diego to deal with. I grew up here. This has been my life. It's always nice to be in San Diego and to come home. Everybody says America's finest city until you start looking under the streets or on the streets with pothole sewers that are, 50 years old, 80 years old, and starting to crumble. We have a crumbling infrastructure underneath the streets, and that's a big ticket item. There's I think Mark will speak to it, about $1 billion of unfunded mandates, and then over 30 years, another $4 or $5 billion that we need to put into this infrastructure, which is defined as physical and organizational structures and facilities, buildings, roads, power structures needed for the operation of a society or an enterprise. That's what infrastructure is, just so you know. And just a quick background on this. The mayor just came out with this 2017 budget. These are the highlights on it. And I know the councilman here was at least thrilled it got a bump for the infrastructure side. The whole budget is $3.3 billion. That's the whole pie right there. There's something called, I'll call it general services, if I'm speaking that correctly. That's for the police, the fire, the basic operation of running the city police fire. You help me out with that. It's okay, parks, libraries, that's this pie there. This one section here, which is now, this same over here is now $373 million, I believe, which is the new capital improvements program that dipped in the last few years and now is as high as it's been in the last 6 years. So I think it got bumped up to $373 million. So that's what the council will be speaking about, and a big bump in street repair. Everybody knows we got potholes everywhere in our city. So Councilman's been in office for how many years now? 4 years, coming up for re-election. He's got a bond issue in June around this. I know he'll be speaking about Proposition H, I believe is the right number. These are his priorities off his website. Rebuilding San Diego is what he'll speak about, tackling the infrastructure backlog, a multi-year capital plan to do that, and doing so with a vibrant economy and public safety involved as well. So that's the councilman's priorities, not something that the typical politician would take on. He's taken on the hard stuff, so we're thrilled to have him here. Before we start with the councilman, we'll he sent a little fun piece that I think you've all seen things like this late evening. This is John Oliver speaking on infrastructure. And Mike, you got the...
Infrastructure. It's our roads, bridges, dams, levees, airports, power grids, basically anything that can be destroyed in an action movie.
Get out of there! Damn it!
Holy shit! If an alien species judged humanity by our most popular movies, they'd think we were furious with asphalt all the time. The problem is, though, when our infrastructure is not being destroyed by robots and/or saved by Bruce Willis, we tend to find it a bit boring.
As you know, infrastructure is not a sexy or glamorous topic.
As much as I'd like to think otherwise, infrastructure is not sexy.
Infrastructure is not very sexy.
Yes, infrastructure like those men we just heard from is sexy. Although, to be fair, that may just be because Hollywood promotes unrealistic standards of infrastructure beauty. That's not what a real road looks like. Real roads have curves. So most people think infrastructure is boring. They think it's boring, but is it? Because I'd argue that it's actually pretty fascinating. And I know that in saying that, I've basically become the rad youth counsellor trying to convince you that Jesus was the Taylor Swift of his time. Revelations is a break-up song to the Romans, guys. Who wants another Mountain Dew? Catch. So let's talk about infrastructure tonight. And let's begin with dams. So bad. Because, well, one of the problems is just fixing things is not politically appealing. Because when you build something new, you get to do this.
2, 3!
There is nothing politicians like more than using oversized scissors to cut through ribbons. But you don't get to cut a ribbon after routine repairs. Infrastructure is like Legos. Building is fun, destroying is fun, but a Lego maintenance set would be the most boring fucking toy in the world. Oh, it comes built and then you maintain it, and if you do it right, nothing happens, and eventually you die. Have fun,
I'll leave that
son.
up there for a minute because it was somewhat ironic because I actually do care about infrastructure, and yet somehow John Oliver picked me up as the first person among these politicians who have the oversized scissors cutting the red ribbon. You know, I actually would encourage you to go to YouTube and watch the full clip because it's a very entertaining 30 minutes or 20 minutes, whatever it is. And he really does a great job of highlighting the massive nationwide infrastructure deficit that we have, which is somewhere around $7 trillion right now. And he also does a good job of really explaining why we're in the predicament that we're in. It's something that, I mean, he talks about it a little bit right here, but it's not limited to San Diego by any means. This is a national issue. I think I misspoke. I think it's actually $3 trillion. I think it's $700 billion in the state of California. But this is a nationwide problem. It's a problem in every big city and a lot of medium and small cities around the country as well. I can't do a whole lot about that, but what I can do is here in San Diego. And so as the chairman of the council's infrastructure committee, I've been working on this issue for the past 3.5 years. And when I got into office, we discovered that there were a number of just structural deficiencies that needed to be corrected. We had issues with understanding what kind of assets that we own and what condition those assets are in. We did not have, not only actually, did we not have a multi-year capital plan, which is something that's fairly common to have, right? Most large governments have one. The port has one, the county has one, big cities have them, small cities have them. Not only did we not have a multi-year capital plan, we couldn't find evidence that we'd ever had one. And that really, I think, underscored a lot of the reason that we were in this predicament in the first place was that nobody at City Hall, at least for a long time, had really looked at infrastructure in a long-term strategic kind of way. We would do an infrastructure budget year by year with whatever pennies we could scrounge together from under the cushions down at City Hall. But most of the capital projects that we're doing are not year by year. You're not going to get them done in 1 year. You know, if you're building a fire station, you've got to identify the land, you've got to buy the land, you've got to design the fire station, go out for community feedback on your design, redesign it, and then actually construct it, and then spend the next 50 or 100 years maintaining it. It's clearly not a 1-year process, and yet that's how we are budgeting for projects like this. I mean, it obviously doesn't make sense. So we got the city's first ever multi-year capital plan put in place 2 years ago, and in fact, we've now updated it once. So every year it's going to get a little bit better. We discovered that our own bureaucracy was getting in the way of projects getting done more quickly. That the authority for, as one example, for the mayor to execute contracts of relatively small dollar amounts was too low. And so a contract for a relatively small amount of money would have to go to the city council. The mayor would propose it. It would come to council, it would go to a committee, come back to council, go back to the mayor. It was just not a very efficient process, and time was being wasted, and frankly, dollars were being wasted as well. So we were able to put into place about 15 streamlining measures covering these sorts of topics where we're able to really try to get projects out the door more quickly and cut by as much time as possible the amount of time it takes a project to go from concept to completion, and try to get City Hall out of the way as much as we can. So that was a big victory. Getting money in the budget to do condition assessments on a regular basis was hugely important as well. I remember when our former mayor, whose name we don't need to speak, we were talking to him about getting money in his budget for doing a citywide condition assessment of sidewalks, which we had never done before, despite the fact that we were getting complaints by just about everybody, particularly in our older parts of town like downtown here, that our sidewalks were in bad shape. We had never gone around and assessed exactly how bad they were. And he didn't want to do that because if we knew how bad the problem was, we'd be on the hook for actually solving it. And to my mind, I mean, that's why we're here. You know, we're here in office for a fairly short amount of time to actually tackle these big issues. And we don't get to tackle all of the big issues as quickly as we'd like or get them all solved as quickly as we would like. But on some level, these are the problems that our constituents elected us to solve. And so fortunately, we got the money in the budget, and we were able to do that condition assessment of sidewalks and get a lot of really, really valuable data out of that. So we've got the multi-year capital plan. We're routinely doing these condition assessments as we should be, and gets us to the point where we're really in a position now to figure out over the next number of years what's the step forward. So I've leapfrogged a bunch of stuff here. Wastewater lines, we have a couple of airports, we have bike paths, traffic signals, fire stations, a bunch of whole different buildings. So we have a lot of things going on. So I ran through some of this already. So it gets us to the funding issue. So we've got a fairly substantial infrastructure deficit, a backlog, if you will, over the next 5 years is projected to be $1.4 billion. Now, it's important to remember that this problem was not created overnight, and we're not going to solve it overnight. And even though this is a 5-year backlog, again, this wasn't created in 5 years. We're not going to solve it in 5 years. The reality is a lot of these projects, even if we had $1.4 billion in cash lying around, they're not going to get done in 5 years because a lot of them are stormwater related, require some amount of permitting and everything else that has to go through multiple agencies out of our control. And the reality is that that's not really the goal. The goal is long-term putting the city on the right path forward. So you can see now that one thing that we're hearing, I would say the biggest priority case that we're hearing from our constituents is we need the infrastructure fixed. We had the fiscal crisis, the pension crisis, and we've largely gotten through both of those. We're not completely out of the woods, but we're certainly far better off than we were. Now infrastructure is the city's next big crisis, because frankly, it was one of the things as we were going through these other crises that took the first hit. And we talked about our assets already. We talked about the repairing the repair system. Got various things going on there that we already talked about. I think one really important point to make is that when you look at the maintenance of our assets, maintenance, just like we saw in the video, is not in any way glamorous. Deferred maintenance is even less glamorous. But every dollar that you spend on street maintenance, for example, in the short term, can save you $7 on capital replacement costs over time. And this is a pretty simple concept when you think about it, because think about your car. You should be doing oil changes regularly, right? Whatever your car, you get 3,000, 7,000, 10,000 miles, whatever your engine calls for, you should do. And oil changes, 30, 40, 50 bucks. If you go a period of years without doing an oil change, you're going to have serious problems with your engine. You're probably going to need to outright replace it, certainly do some pretty serious repair damage, catch up on it. And that's basically how the city operates as well. If you don't do the routine maintenance on your streets and roads, on your sidewalks, on your city facilities, you're going to have serious problems going forward. And that's where we are right now, is a lot of the problems that we're facing, a lot of that $1.4 billion in deferred maintenance backlog that we've got is due to not doing the routine maintenance when we should have. And again, a lot of that was because we were going through the fiscal crisis and we slashed money on just about everything. We were browning out fire stations. So there's some amount of it that you can understand in terms of the genesis, but it's pretty clear that you should be doing this all along. Unfortunately, from a political standpoint, no one ever got elected or reelected based on maintenance that was or wasn't done, right? It's just not, from a political standpoint, it's not a very salient issue until something breaks, and then it becomes one. So a couple of key concepts here. Infrastructure, you know, there are certain things that we need to solve with it, but fundamentally it's a core function of what we do. It's not like the fiscal crisis or the pension crisis where you get to the point where you've solved it and you're done and you move on. I mean, this is something that is a core function of the local government. If we don't do it, no one else is going to do it for us. And this really needs to be part of every city budget and every 5-year financial plan that we put out. This is something that we need to be doing. What we've learned, I'll go back one more to that third bullet point there, is after we've gone through repairing the repair process and doing all the various reforms that I outlined earlier, one of the things that we quickly saw was that our key structural problem was that with our general fund infrastructure, which again is our streets and roads and our sidewalks and our fire stations and all these, the core problem was that there's not a dedicated revenue source available for doing this routine maintenance. For water and wastewater, we have it. It's our water bills, right? You've got this steady stream of money coming in that you can do pipeline replacement, invest in desalination, invest in pure water. It's something that it's there. And with the general fund infrastructure, we just don't have that. And so that's part of our problem. And so that as we are figuring out, okay, long term, how are we going to really turn the city around and put it on the right path when it comes to rebuilding San Diego, we determined that having that dedicated amount of funding, that dedicated funding mechanism going forward was really how we were going to get this issue under control. And so we came up with Rebuild San Diego, which will be on the June ballot as Proposition H. And I'll get back to that in a minute. What we've got is a three-pronged approach for how we're going to fund infrastructure over the next 25 years. And this is a charter amendment. It is not a tax increase. It is not a bond measure. This is setting up a dedicated revenue source going forward for the city's general fund infrastructure. And so the first line there you can see is excess sales tax growth. So what happens is over time, as people spend more money and the city's economy just naturally grows and the city brings in more tax revenue as a result of this growth, we're saying that we should dedicate a chunk of that growth above an inflationary metric, CPI, and take that chunk and dedicate that specifically to the city's infrastructure. And I'll show you a chart on that in a second. The second one is a 5-year measure, and this is an outgrowth of what the mayor has proposed in his last 3 budgets, which is taking half of major general fund growth as the city's economy has been recovering from the Great Recession and put that right back into our city's neighborhood infrastructure. And then the third thing requires a little bit more explanation, and that is taking 100% of net pension savings and putting that into the city's infrastructure as well. And what this is, as we went through the pension crisis and bad decisions were made 12 and 14 years ago now, where the city's pension system was deliberately underfunded in exchange for retroactively granting benefit increases, which was a double whammy of bad decisions. What happened was we accumulated this massive unfunded liability of about $2 billion. It's set to be paid off, I mean, this was 10 years ago, over about originally it was going to be 20 years, SD Sears extended it about 25 years. But think of it like a mortgage, right? At some point it gets paid off. When it gets paid off, the city's cash flow position increases pretty well. Right now, every July 1st, which is the start of our fiscal year, we write a check to the city's pension system. This year it's about $260 million. And that just goes to pay off that year's portion of the unfunded liability in addition to the normal costs that we would just have. So what happens is, over time, that unfunded liability goes away. Just like your mortgage. You just keep paying it down, eventually it goes away. Or if you want to think of it as credit card debt, whatever you want. Eventually it goes away. And what we're saying is, as part of this measure, as that unfunded liability goes down and the city has some cash flow net savings that result, that money should be invested back into the city's infrastructure. And the nexus there is that as the city went through the fiscal crisis, which was brought on in part by the pension crisis, one of the first things that got cut was the city's infrastructure maintenance budget. We stopped slurry sealing roads. We stopped maintaining city building facilities. You go down to Balboa Park, you see the buildings literally crumbling, right? You go to city fire stations, rec centers, libraries, and you see buildings that have a lot of deferred maintenance. Potholes are very evident throughout the city. So we stopped investing in our infrastructure maintenance due to this, partly because of this problem. As we start to reap benefits from voter-approved pension reform and these other things and paying down the liability, that money should be invested back into our city neighborhoods, and so that's what we're proposing. And so this is a little graph that illustrates the sales tax part of what I was describing. So the bottom part in gray is just the baseline that we've set, which was the last fiscal year. So that stays constant. The chunk above is the growth, okay, over the next 25 years. The blue, both of those are the growth. The blue growth will go to just regular city services, right? Cops, firefighters, library hours, rec center hours, all the things that the city does, that will go towards that. The amount above that is the amount in excess of inflation, and that's the jagged part. That's the part we're saying, as part of this measure, will be dedicated to the city's infrastructure projects and maintenance. Over time, you're talking about just under 20% of the sales tax over that period of 25 years, just under 20% of the sales tax going towards infrastructure projects and maintenance. It's a good amount of money. It's not a huge amount of money by any means. It's far more than what we've done in the past. Over the life of the measure, it will be somewhere between $2 and $3 billion just from this component alone. And it's more than that. It's about 3/4. Well, it depends on, there's some variables in there, but it's somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the total. The half of major general fund growth for the next 5 years, I outlined, this is something that, this is a somewhat shorter and smaller amount of money, a shorter time frame, smaller amount of money. And then you've got net pension savings. And so what you see is that for the next decade or so, you know, it kind of goes up and down. It'll depend on stock market returns, things like that. But then once the unfunded liability is paid off, which you could see occurs in about 2028, 2029, depending on how things go, there's a huge amount of cash that's freed up. And that money will continue for a number of years. And so that's going to give us a lot more money available at that point.
Mark, can I ask you to go back for a second?
Sure.
I don't think they can see the dates. These dates here are 2018, so we have savings, but then this is the unfunded portion.
So you can see that, I mean, and again, a lot of this is going to be dictated by stock market returns. So we're not dedicating a specific dollar amount out of this because we obviously can't predict the stock market, you know, next week, let alone 10 years from now or 5 years from now. What we're saying is whatever savings exist, those savings will get put into the city's infrastructure. And over time, in an individual year, we can't predict it, but over time, over the 25-year life of this measure, this should dedicate somewhere between $1 and $2 billion of what has been going towards the pension fund. Once the unfunded liability is paid off, that $1 to $2 billion will get freed up and be able to be invested into the city's infrastructure. So what you see in totality with those three revenue streams that I described is somewhere up to $4.5 billion. We'll conservatively call it between $3 and $4 billion. It's not a tax increase. Utilizes the natural growth in the economy as well as the savings in the pension system. And then there's a suspension clause as well. And this was something that actually our credit guys on Wall Street told us was important to them. They wanted to see a suspension clause be put in there so that a supermajority of the council could suspend this in times of true economic crisis for 1 year at a time. And that's something, obviously, we hope not to have to utilize. But if we go through another Great Recession, maybe something that we have to do for 1 year at a time. And then, of course, the money gets reinvested right back into our city neighborhoods. And importantly, because of the current climate and some of the civic debate, this money is specifically prohibited from being used for either a new convention center expansion or a new football stadium. Those have their own separate tracks and potentially funding measures coming up. So we've got broad-based support for this. The council vote on it was 7-2. We've got the mayor's support. We've got groups such as the Chamber of Commerce. We've got the BIA, the Downtown Partnership. We've got very, very broad-based support from people who recognize that this measure is long overdue, that had this been put into place 25 years ago, we wouldn't need to have this conversation today because we wouldn't be in this fix that we're in right now. but it wasn't. And so really, this is how we're going to put the city on the right path forward. And I'll just say, because one criticism has been, well, if we vote on this today, the citizens are going to think that this is, the infrastructure is solved, that we've done our work and we can move on to the next topic. And that if anybody wanted to do anything in the future on infrastructure, that somehow that wouldn't be politically viable. And to that I would say, when we went through the fiscal crisis and the pension crisis, we as citizens took multiple votes, public votes on charter amendments and various things, many times over several election cycles to right the ship. I'm not suggesting that over the next 25 years, this is the only time that the citizens are going to need to weigh in on some kind of infrastructure measure. There may be others, but for now, this is what we need to do to put the city on the right path forward, to set up a dedicated revenue source specifically for city infrastructure projects and maintenance, and to really be able to show citizens that we're better spending the money that they're already sending us. And that's really where we are today. This is the right path for San Diego. It's why we have broad-based support, and it really is time to rebuild our city. This is how we're going to do it. So again, it's Prop H on the ballot. There's a lot of technical charter amendments and things like that, but you know, we're confident that people will wade through and get down to Prop H and really recognize that rebuilding San Diego is important. It's long overdue, and this is how we're going to do it. So with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to talk here again, and be happy to take any questions you might have.
Give her a hand. Thank you. So just my question quick, is this a majority vote or a 2/3 vote?
Thank you. That's a great question. Because it's a charter amendment rather than a bond issuance or a tax increase or anything like that, it is a simple majority vote, 50% plus one. And so that's, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a good point. Yep.
So a question, David. You have to use the mic so it can be heard, okay?
All right, thank you very much. On the potential in a difficult economic situation for the council, for a supermajority of the council to defer on an annual basis, are there any metrics that guide the council on that, or is it strictly a political decision?
It's a political decision. We toyed with the idea of putting in specific metrics and maybe conditions that had to be met and things like that. And I mean, obviously, I'd prefer it never be suspended, but there was sentiment among a majority of my colleagues, as well as our independent budget analyst, that really we leave some amount of flexibility. And I think with a 2/3 supermajority vote required, I think that in and of itself is difficult enough to achieve that there would have to be a pretty good reason for suspension. We did require that it has to have a public hearing, so it couldn't just be on a consent calendar that just gets approved with a whole bunch of other things and they don't have to talk about it. It would have to be its own item with a public hearing to justify why it was being suspended. So again, we hope it wouldn't have to be used, but if it does, it's going to have to be a pretty good reason, and it's not going to be an easy thing to do. Yeah.
Have we gone to Washington? Have we put our senators and congressmen to work to bring more money into San Diego?
Well, we've certainly tried. I mean, obviously everybody else is doing that as well, right? So we go to, I'm part of a delegation that goes to Washington every year, usually in September, and we try to, you know, meet with as many folks as we can and try to get more money for everything from, you know, Pure Water is a great example where we're trying to get some federal assistance with our Pure Water program, to homelessness funding. I mean, the San Diego is getting shortchanged every year, considering the magnitude of the homelessness problem that we face. But the formula that Washington uses is antiquated, and it's based on housing stock data that is decades old. And so since we're a relatively new city, we're getting shortchanged year after year after year. We need to get that formula changed. But at some point, it requires the political will of the Congress and the president to agree. And, well, you know how Washington is. So it's a long slog. To get anything done in Washington takes a lot of work. And it's certainly not for lack of effort, but obviously we're just one region among many in the entire country that's you know, making the same case.
Could I ask, you said the council vote was 7-2 on this one. Could you step out of your advocate role and say, okay, there were two people that were against it. Why they were against it? Or did you share that earlier about the criticism of what their
I shared it a little bit in part, yeah. So my one colleague, David Alvarez, actually voted in favor of it the first time, and then changed his vote and voted against it. He had a proposal that was in some ways more aggressive and did not have the support of our colleagues for what he had put forth. He wanted to base this on property taxes rather than sales taxes, and there was not the support of our colleagues to do that. Todd Gloria, who's a good friend and been a partner on this issue for a number of years, has been championing a mega bond issuance that would require a sales tax increase. And we evaluated that carefully, and it was a thoughtful proposal. The problem is that when you look at November, there are a lot of revenue measures that are going to be potentially on the ballot. I mean, the most obvious one is the stadium and convention center plan put forward now by the Chargers. Simultaneous to that, you've got the Citizens Initiative being floated by Corey Briggs. You've got a measure that Sandag is looking at to raise. It's another half-cent sales tax that would raise money for a variety of things, including some freeway money, some mass transit money, some habitat mitigation money, as well as a Prop 30 extension by the state, as well as potentially a firehouse construction bond that my colleague Marty Emerald is floating. So if you've got 3, 4, 5, 6 tax increase measures on the same ballot, there's a pretty good chance that they're all going to lose. Yep. And we didn't want something as important as the city's infrastructure, which we've been working so hard on, to get lumped in with all of these and to, I guess, for lack of a better word, guilt by association, right? People just say, oh, people are, these politicians are asking for too much money, and they just wind up voting no on everything. So we wanted to do it this way. If 5 or 10 years from now, my successors decide that that mega bond issue is a good idea, and that we're able to prove to people that we're more efficiently spending the money that they're already giving us, and that there's still not enough money, and they want to go out and make the case for a tax increase to do whatever with, they can do that. And maybe at that point, that's a more politically viable argument than it would be right now.
So if this gets passed in June, it's passed.
It's passed, that's right.
Ah, okay, nice.
Yep,
nice.
indeed. And by the way, that's another reason why we wanted to go in June instead of November, was so we wouldn't get lumped in with all the measures that are going to be on the November ballot.
Good. And who's driving it? I mean, your office obviously is going to be driving this. Who else is your supporters that you had there? They're putting their money and voice behind it.
Absolutely. I mean, I authored it, so I'm obviously a big proponent. But the mayor, 6 of my colleagues on the council, and then the groups like I mentioned, the chamber, the downtown partnership, the BIA, the AGC, number of groups around town.
I'm Ron Amberger. What mechanism has there been established for prioritizing the infrastructure projects that in other words, what's the game plan?
This is a great question. So project prioritization is something we've been working on for the last couple of years. And we have a council policy right now on project prioritization. And so we have a scoring system that enables the public works professionals and the department heads under whose jurisdiction that each project falls. They're able to take this scoring worksheet and kind of put projects side by side and rate them on everything from, how shovel ready are they? Is the funding lined up? Do they already have the appropriate community feedback? Is there, are there, just, various hindrances, permits, whatever that might be required that would delay these? Do we already have the land? Things like that. We'll probably need to tweak that over time, just as projects change and certain ones get done and other ones come up. But our big concern was setting up the funding mechanism to make sure that the money is there. And the project prioritization is a process that, again, we've got one in place now. It'll evolve over time. 10 years from now, it may look quite a bit different than what it does today. But the important thing is that the funding mechanism itself is there. It's in the city charter. It can only be taken away by another vote of the people. And really making sure that that money is there and available for the city's infrastructure projects was really the key.
Very nice. Yes, please.
Has looking at assessing the developers when they put up these new high-rise buildings, has any thought been given to basically asking them to foot part of the bill for the infrastructure that's going to be needed for these buildings.
Yeah, they
Over and above the sales tax issue.
Sure. Well, they do, and every new unit that is built in San Diego, whether it's multifamily or single family, requires a contribution to a what's called a development impact fee or a facilities benefit assessment. And we've got different communities that fall into different categories, but each community in the city has an amount, and it's based on the public infrastructure that is needed to accommodate this new development. And it varies from neighborhood to neighborhood. My district, which is newer, we've got a lot more single-family homes that are being built on what was just, greenfield before them. And so you've got a need for brand new roads and fire stations and schools and all these things that didn't previously exist. Downtown, it's a little different. If a high-rise goes up, it's not really about the road necessarily. It may need to be redone or widened or something like that, but the road exists. But there might need to be money put into, build a new fire station, for example, to accommodate the growth. And the developers do that already. And in fact, there was a report that came out a few weeks ago, and I'm not going to quote the exact numbers because I don't want to misstate them, but it said that for every new housing unit that comes to the market in San Diego, there's a fairly good chunk of that is related specifically to the fees that are imposed by the government, whether local or the state. And that's something that it's a fine line, right? Because certainly they need to share in their costs of the infrastructure, particularly as it relates to the infrastructure that is impacted by what they're building. On the other hand, as a high cost of living city, we don't want to make housing so expensive that people can't afford to buy it. And that's a real problem for us going forward. In fact, I would suggest that after we get our arms better around the infrastructure issue, that the housing crisis is probably the next big one we face, because we're trying to have companies that want to be here to offer good, high-paying jobs for San Diegans, but unfortunately, our housing stock is not keeping up with that. And so long-term, I think housing and the shortage of what I'll call market rate housing that is affordable, which is distinct from affordable housing, which is government subsidized housing, that is a serious long-term problem for us, and we're going to have to get our arms around it. But to answer your question, we do require that of developers now. In fact, you could make a case that over the last 10 years, we've become overly reliant on developer-funded infrastructure. So again, in my district, most of the infrastructure that we've got, certainly in the newest communities I represent, almost all the infrastructure was put in by developers. But when you become overly reliant on that, you're able to not put city tax dollars into the projects that need them. And so that's really where this mechanism comes in, is making sure, especially in our older communities that don't always have those opportunities for development, or if they do, they're kind of one-off projects rather than huge swaths of land. Making sure that you've got dollars set aside for our older communities is very important. And so that's what this measure will help accomplish as well.
Any more? One last one that was more personal than anything else, because it happened right out in front of our office here. Maybe a couple of years ago, they were digging up the street, putting in blue pipe, all along 3rd Avenue here. And my wife and I both said, how many times do you dig up a street in one project? You dig, you put pipe in, you cover it back over, you dig again.
Right.
I saw that happen at least 3 times, where there was a dig, put something in, come back a week later, dig it out. And I just wondered who's managing that, or maybe there's a reason for it that I didn't understand, but it just seemed like if they were doing multiple pipes or things at the same time, wouldn't they aggregate that process? And I don't know if it's a city job or a contractor job, but I just said there's got to be a more efficient way.
Well, the answer is that, I mean, again, looking historically, the problem is that not enough people were thinking about infrastructure in a strategic way. And so you didn't always have that coordination between departments, city departments, to know that, we should probably replace the water lines running under the street before we repave the street, so that we don't have to tear the street up and then go through the whole thing all over again. In fact, one of the very first votes I cast 4 years ago was on what was called the Street Preservation Ordinance. And it specifically prohibited exactly what you're talking about, Peter, which is tearing up a street and then realizing that 6 months or a year later, there was going to be either a water line installed, or maybe AT&T was going to do some fiber optic lines, or we're going to do utility undergrounding like we're doing in a lot of the city. And really trying to look at this in a more strategic way. And so right now there are penalties in place. Basically, it says that you can't. There's a moratorium on digging up a newly paved street for a period of time. And the period of time is based on whether it was a slurry seal job or a complete asphalt overlay. But the bottom line is that situation, unless it's an emergency, obviously, if you have a water pipe break, there's not much you can do. But if it's a planned project, right now, you cannot dig up the street if it was just recently repaved. Within the last, I believe it's either somewhere between 5 or 6 years, something like that. So it's something that we probably should have done a long time ago to address some of those issues, because I get those complaints all the time. But we have fixed it.
Isn't it great to have yeah? Okay. Hang on.
Yeah, I also have a more personal comment or questions. Like, I'm pretty new to San Diego. I'm actually pretty new to the States because I'm Chinese, and I used to live in Europe, in the Netherlands for 8 years. So actually, and I'm an urban planner. So actually infrastructure, I think for me, it could be really sexy, let's say, because for example, if you look at the cities in Europe, they're actually really branding the idea of infrastructure and make it really attractive. Like, for example, in the Netherlands or Copenhagen, they really make a really good system of bicycle lane and the sidewalk system, so that people can really enjoy those kind of infrastructure. So let's say if you associate the idea of infrastructure with lifestyle, probably it become more interesting for people and for, I don't know, government or something, to really think about it. And when I first came to the States, one thing really struck me is, I understand here is really suburbanized, and I'm living in Rancho Bernardo, so I'm really car dependent. And this is completely different with the way I used to live in the Netherlands. I didn't have a car in the Netherlands for 8 years. And I had car in the first day when I landed the States.
Right.
Yeah, so I think actually, for me personally, I think the sidewalk, or let's say public transport, is really an important issue in terms of infrastructure in San Diego.
Right.
So I'm actually wondering, especially you are also in Rancho Bernardo, so
Right.
how do you see this?
No, I agree. I mean, welcome to Southern California, right? I mean, it's a car culture, and I went to school in Chicago, so I spent a number of years there, and I would say that the advantage to cities back east and even big cities in the Midwest like Chicago is that they planned out a public transportation system long ago, right? So if you put in your rail lines, 100 years ago, it was a lot easier. The city was a lot less developed. It was a lot cheaper to do so. Trying to replicate that kind of system and overlay it into a city like San Diego is really, really expensive. Even if you could find the land, which sometimes you can, it gets inordinately expensive. And so, we do have Sandag working on that. They're working on a line right now, and then there's another rail line that they're looking to put in, light rail line that they want to put in. But it's just a really, really expensive proposition. And it's really going to be difficult for it ever to reach places like Rancho Bernardo up in my district, because it's just so far away, it's so expensive, and I think there's always the question of, would you actually get the ridership levels to support it? Right now we do have bus service in my district, and I'll see buses drive by that have nobody on them. Now we do have the bus rapid service, which is good. It runs through the express lanes that go up and down the 15, but I think on the ordinary city buses, those are a challenge in my district, because it's just not all that convenient. It takes a long time, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think mass transit is always going to be difficult out here. I think that there are some interesting models that we could take a look at. Certainly it works better in the kind of the urban core of our city in terms of getting people around. We used to have streetcars running all around the streets of downtown and the neighborhoods right around downtown 100 years ago, and then we ripped them all out when the automobile came around, and now it seems like we're trying to head back in the old direction. So I think that there are places where it makes more sense than others. I think it's always going to be tough when you start getting 20, 30 miles outside of downtown, it's just going to be tough to be able to justify it financially just given the cost. Yeah.
I just love having thoughtful, smart policymakers in to share what they're doing. I don't think we have enough of those, in our lives. And Mark is one of the good guys, and it's really nice to have you here again. Would you thank him for joining us?
Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Peter. Appreciate your kind words.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you too. Thanks, guys.